Welcome to King Arthur and Lady of the Lake. We are discussing today, Michael, the shame epidemic.
I don't know how I feel about this.
By the way, hi, how are
Let's
you,
go.
Michael?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm well. I'm so excited about the shame epidemic. I didn't even introduce us. Yeah,
I think I would hope that people know how many episodes are we in now?
I
12?
think this could be 14.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. Cool. Cool.
Mm,
Cool. 14, possibly 15. Who knows? But yeah, I think people know us now, don't they?
I hope so. I hope
Helen
so.
and Michael. I hope so too. I hope so too. We've had some really good feedback, haven't we, from the episodes that we've done prior? Um, good feedback, and we've had lots of questions too. So one of the things that we discussed is that what we would actually love is if you have a question about anything that we've spoken about over the last, you know, the whole time, because we're about to wrap up our season for 2020. And so what we'd love to do is our final episode for the end of the year is basically a Q&A thing. So we'd love to receive your questions. If you have any questions about anything that we've spoken about over the last 4, 8, 12, it'll be 4 months, won't it?
Mm, mm,
Over the last 4 months since our first episode, up until the last, please post them in the YouTube video, respective YouTube video, and we'll go through them, and we'll jot down your questions and then have a discussion around answering them for our final episode of season 1 for 2020, and then we'll be rejoining you next year in 2021
mm.
with a slightly different format. But we're looking forward to that as well, aren't we?
It's going to be very, very cool. Very cool.
Very cool.
Yeah, I think I've had some, funnily enough, actually, this plays into the shame epidemic. I've had, with the dark side of the sisterhood, I got a lot of response from that.
Did
And
you?
I,
Having
yeah,
spoken about this, I'd love to
yeah.
hear. Yeah.
But funnily enough, I got a lot of response personally on Messenger
Did
rather
you?
than publicly. And
Yeah. Okay.
so that is, that kind of like, am I allowed to talk about this? And the shame around supporting things that don't necessarily seem to be, what's the word? Politically correct.
Yeah. Politically correct. Hey, that
Mm,
seems to be a lot of that going around. People don't feel like they can speak into something. They can talk about something, even how they're truly feeling about a situation or a person or even themselves, because it's not societally acceptable or politically correct, whatever terminology we want to use. And it's often around, and it speaks into what we're going to talk about today. It's often around feeling ashamed of how they feel and the fact that they even have certain thoughts about certain things. And then I think it goes even deeper around acceptance. So if we start to verbalize some of this stuff and we start to really feel into how we feel about a
mm,
certain subject, topic, or person, there's some shame around doing that because we know that we're likely to get judged by someone, aren't we?
mm.
Mm.
And it's funny, I always see that shame is different to guilt. So for me, I feel shame is given by another person and guilt is carried by us. So I think we are shamed by people and then we carry guilt. And that guilt then can transform into our shame of ourselves, but it's because we've been shamed for it. So, and I suppose there's a couple of different levels to that. Shame is in being found out, but
Yep.
guilt is personal, isn't it?
Do you think that I would agree with that? And I would also go a little bit further than to say, as to say, shame also speaks into feeling ashamed, right?
Mm,
For our behavior, for our actions, for our thoughts. And that doesn't necessarily have to come from external, that can come from within as well, can't it? So
mm,
I know that there's, and I'm sure we could all say the same, there's things that I've done in the past that I am ashamed of, that I
mm,
was ashamed of. Now I understand from a different perspective in regards to how we can just act unconsciously in life. But back then, I was very ashamed of myself. And that wasn't because anybody said anything to me. It's like after, because we all know the difference between right and wrong,
mm,
you know. And so when we do something that we know blatantly after the fact is wrong, it's like, oh, I feel quite ashamed. I feel ashamed of about doing that. Would
mm.
you agree that
Yeah.
that shame can also be internal.
Yeah. And then you have, and then what being ashamed does is it creates guilt feelings. And so then
Yes.
we have to forgive the guilt that we carry about something we did that we were ashamed of.
Yep.
So it's
Yep.
still, I don't think we do personally shame ourselves. I think we feel ashamed and then we carry the guilt for that.
Yep.
But also, what's interesting, what do you think then that the behavior is that we display when we are ashamed of ourselves?
I think it depends upon what we're ashamed of and what the circumstances were around that. I think our behavior is going to be, some people will do one of two things. People will do one of two things. They will either avoid the person or the situation altogether because they feel guilt around the shame, feeling ashamed. So they'll do that, or they will make overt efforts towards the person to try and almost make up for whatever it was that they did without actually coming out and acknowledging and saying, this is what I did wrong. I'm taking responsibility. I'm sorry. Um, I hope there's forgiveness here. Instead, what they do, it's almost like they overdo things in the relationship.
Mm,
Does that
mm.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it does.
Or in the situation. So if someone's, and I've observed this in the workplace actually, where someone has done the wrong thing and they know they've done the wrong thing, but rather than come out and say, I'm sorry, and asking for forgiveness, what they will do is they will then overperform and they will be even nicer towards people to try and make up for whatever it is that they've done instead of just taking responsibility.
Mm, yeah, yeah. And in our current environment of social media, people are so regularly publicly shamed for just having an opinion that's
Yep.
different to other people.
Yep.
And yet we are held as well to an incredible standard of behavior that causes us then to hide stuff
Mm,
that doesn't meet that standard.
yep.
So, and we see all the time addictive behaviors being hidden that, people then are ashamed of, and then they're worried about being found out. And so there
Mm,
becomes this shame epidemic, which we're
yep.
carrying, that really, if we were able to be accepted as we are, and that the world around us could accept us a bit easier,
Mm.
we wouldn't necessarily have the issues that we have around this now.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think a lot of this comes back to feeling judged as well, because feeling judged, and also people people actually do judge quite harshly, right? And we all know that that's their stuff. But then when we do get judged, when we feel judged, it does create shame within us. So I think we can talk about shame, guilt, and judgment all in the same little package in the same container, because I think they're all very connected. I know in the past when I step out and I speak into masculinity in men, or I will speak out against uh, real unhealthy feminism, which seeks to just minimize men, I've been judged quite harshly by those people, by those extreme feminists, for having a point of view, just
Mm,
simply having a point of view.
mm,
And even some feminized men that I've come across over the years since I've been speaking into this, um, even they feel challenged, and because they feel challenged by it, there's then judgment. It's like, oh, you're just trying to be an alpha male, and it's very that's toxic masculinity. And then we can even bring labeling into this, right? We judge things and then we seek to label them, and then we shame others into feeling guilty, right? So that then we hope what they will do is they will then conform to our beliefs and
mm,
our way of thinking, our values, our whatever. So there's
mm,
a lot of control and manipulation in all of that as well.
mm.
There's so many, actually, now that I've been talking into that, and you and I have been talking into, it's actually quite deep, isn't it? When
Mm,
we start to think about the repercussions of a shame epidemic in our society around judgments, labeling, guilt, shame, um, and all of that.
mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it is really the start of 1,000 ills, isn't it?
It
You know,
is. It is.
it's kind of that fall apart stage. So once you start feeling shame, the cover up of that
Yeah.
almost causes its own demise as well. I
Mm.
know that there's been things that have happened to me during my life where it's been out of my ability to be able to do something really well.
Yep.
It's just been a situation that's happened that you're doing the best you can, but you know that you've not followed through with something that you said you would do, or that you've not completed something the best of your ability because something else has happened. And it's really hard to face that, especially when you're younger, to be able to say, oh, look, I didn't do that well. It's again, it kind of brings in then the fight and flight and the stress
Yep.
responses
Yep.
to being ashamed and all of that. But the shame epidemic, it really calls in the fact that we're all affected by it. And so then it calls into, well, do we just acknowledge it? Can we just acknowledge it? And if we acknowledge it, does it make the shame go away?
I think if we acknowledge it, that's a good first step with anything, right? When we acknowledge, but then I think we have to go a step further. I think we have to acknowledge the fact, and we should be acknowledging the fact that there is this shame epidemic in our society. But then all of us, and this might be utopia, but all of us as a collective going, yeah, okay, there is this shame epidemic out there, and we don't want to acknowledge it because it feels then like we're all just being very judgy out there in society. And I don't want to come across like that. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm like that, even though I observe it. It's the same with a lot of the things that you and I talk into. They're out there, but not a lot of people actually want to acknowledge them. And we
Mm,
prefer to avoid and suppress and deny them. And then what happens is it forces all of this underground even more, doesn't it? And then it
mm,
becomes an epidemic. I think a lot of these things that we talk about, you and I, could be easily labeled, if we want to label it, as an epidemic,
mm,
because because it exists. We can acknowledge it within ourselves, but then we don't feel empowered enough and courageous enough to acknowledge it publicly and say, yes, it exists. And yes, I've felt it. And yes, I've observed it. I think if we could all do that, then things like the shame epidemic wouldn't have any legs anymore. There just wouldn't be anything there. And
mm,
so we could all live our lives and do our thing with loving, good intention and have an opinion and have a perspective and not feel like we're going to be ridiculed or demonized for that.
mm, mm. But it's the discomfort, isn't it? Because talking about the behaviors that have caused it or what we did wrong, it forces us to admit things that we didn't do well. It forces
Yep.
you to actually speak out loud about the things you don't like about yourself, about the things that you've not performed well in. It's all sorts of things like that, which it's the discomfort of that, and whether then people will still like you if you admit that you've done that. So then there's the hiding.
Yep.
And we talked a few episodes ago, I think, about having that success and having it all. And I think it was when we talked about the dark side of the sisterhood and the brotherhood, about women kind of holding it together and men trying
Yep.
to be this kind of fake, like holding the success thing. And it's interesting that in order to get these things that we think that we need as a society, the behaviors underneath that help us to maintain it. So drinking and drugs and other addictions that really help us to kind of deal with the emotion in order to get the stuff that's surface driven,
Yep.
and then hiding the fact that you are drinking at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, or that you are a secret coke user in the bathroom at work because you're supposed to be creative all the time, but really you're falling apart. And there's kind of the functioning alcoholics and the functioning drug takers, both in domestic situations and in high corporate. So that's also, it's almost that because there's a shame epidemic, we're creating behaviors that are shameful to deal with what we need to hide. It's
Yeah,
just
and on top of that, all that as well, we're all denying the fact that it's there, and that
yeah.
we all have at some point engaged in some kind of behavior that we feel ashamed of, and then we feel guilty for, and maybe if other people find out, if they have, then we're going to feel guilty for having been found out. So there's a lot of stuff here around the shame epidemic, um, and shame, and we talked about guilt and judgment and labeling and all of that. So, yeah, it's a bit of a big topic, isn't it? As we always do with these things that we talk about, we open Pandora's box and we give people permission then to speak into it even more deeply and ask questions and give their perspectives as well, which
Mm,
which we would love for you to give. You know, if you felt ashamed, do you feel like there's a shame epidemic out there? Do you think that that's because we judge each other so harshly and that we don't feel like we can actually have an opinion, even though it's not an opinion that seeks to harm others? It's simply our perspective, our point of view. What do you think? We'd love to hear your feedback on this as well.
Mm, yeah. Why do you think we do judge each other so harshly?
I think we judge people because we we see something in them that we wish we had within ourselves, or even the courage to express. And what that does is it challenges our psyche on such a deep level, because it's like, they can do it, why can't I? And then rather than take responsibility, rather than step into that and be a little bit courageous and say something that might seem controversial, we project all of that. We project our shadow. You know, we've talked about this so much, the shadow. We project our shadow onto this other person and then judge their behavior. But
Mm,
what we're really doing is we really seek to embody what it is that that person does.
mm. And it's the mask as well, isn't it? It's the terror that somebody might find out that you're not who you painted yourself to be.
There is
And
that too, definitely.
there's the
Definitely.
hiding of the mask. So, I mean, I've actually seen, um, in fact, this is a personal experience. I was at a dinner party and we were talking about something, and something came up, and they were like, "Oh my God, yeah, I know who does that." And there was this kind of joke around the table. And later on, my friend pulled me aside and she said, "Actually, I've done that in the past." And it was, and she knows that I'm a very safe place. So she was able to admit that to me.
Yep.
And yet in that situation, I mean, I just hugged her and just, I was just so impressed by her telling me.
Yep.
But in that situation, that is your typical shame situation where she was ashamed of herself enough
Mm.
to not say, actually, I've done that.
Yep.
And then she felt that she would in turn be shamed by the group. So in that situation, it makes me wonder whether, had that person said, actually, I do that, whether somebody else would go, actually, I've done that in the past too. And we could have completely changed that for the women in the room.
There is that. There is that, absolutely. And I think there's a lot to be said for one person stepping in and saying, actually, I've done that, and then kind of challenging the room to judge them,
Mm,
right? And to say something, because I don't think in a group situation, people would actually want to be seen as the first person to judge, right?
mm,
Um, but there's also another aspect which I've experienced as well. It's kind of like, I think people hold back on putting their hand up and saying, yes, that's me, or yes, I've done that, because it's almost like you don't want to be that person that creates an awkward situation for everybody else. And even in that, we are judging internally that we are going to create something that is awkward for others and
mm,
assuming that other people are going to feel uncomfortable.
mm,
But there's also that part of it as well, where I think we don't wish to create an environment in which other people might feel uncomfortable.
mm, mm. And in that way, then, do we think that we're the only one because it's so shameful and nobody ever
Yeah.
does it? And really, we're the only one who would do that. And so we are even more disgusting than we thought in the first place. And then we need
Yep.
to hide it more and bury it more. And then there's more personal guilt about that. And then, that
And
into.
imagine if anybody found out, and imagine if I said something, and imagine if they looked at me differently now, and imagine if I lost friends, and imagine if my life changed, and imagine um, how awkward this dinner party would then be for the rest of the night if I actually came out and said, actually, I do that.
Mm, mm, yeah.
And then you've got this silence, right?
Mm,
We've all been in those situations where someone has said something totally out of left field, and there's a silence for a moment, and
mm,
then nobody knows actually what to say.
mm, mm.
It's those moments that
I'm
we,
a
I
lover
think
of
we
that.
says,
I'm a
"Oh,
lover
me
of that.
too."
I just instantly fall in love with whoever's made the silence.
Yep, 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 yep,
Because
yep, yep.
I
You
just
and
think,
I, you and
wow.
I. This is why we don't get invited to dinner parties, Helen.
I love a good disruptor, but I do feel that I do hold back myself and have all my life from stepping up and to be controversial because I've, you know, there's that woman thing of being quiet, being nice, smiling, nodding, just looking pretty and not causing any waves.
Mm.
And there is shaming in that if you're a loud woman or if you're this or that or you're
Yep.
against the gender norm that's accepted. There's also kind of a, a bit of a shaming in that too. So that also makes you kind of hold your cards close to your chest, so to speak, which means that then there's a whole host of everybody doing it, and it just rebuilds the mask.
Yeah. And I wonder if all of us actually put our hand up and said, hey, I do this controversial thing that people think is controversial, and I've been afraid of being judged and being shamed for this thing. And I wonder, do you do something, you know? And I wonder if we had this conversation around a dinner table, for instance, or at a restaurant. It's like we all turn up to dinner, for instance. Here's a thing that we could all go out there and do. Get a group of people together and all your friends or your family. Can you imagine in a family doing this? And the agenda is this, right? We're all going to catch up. We're going to go out for dinner, and each person is going to share their deepest, darkest secret. And we're all going to make a commitment not to judge and to love unconditionally and give support and offer, each person the freedom of expression. Can
Mm,
you imagine how liberating that would be for people in general? And also how connecting that could be for relationships, whether they're siblings, parents, intimate partners, cousins, whatever it might be.
mm.
Imagine if we could turn up and there's a non-judgmental environment. We could all share our deepest, darkest secret. You know, can you imagine? Can you
It's
imagine how
almost
liberating?
like it's almost like a drunken truth or dare night.
Yeah, but everyone's sober and everyone turns up with the
Yeah.
same intention, and everyone's got the butterflies in their tummy, and everyone's got the sweaty palms, and everyone's a little bit hesitant, but you all know you're there for the purpose of supporting each other. I would love for people to do that.
I have to be honest about that one. As you know, I ran this show where I spoke about what happens if we never get our shit together. I mentioned it
Yep.
before. But on that show, it was a women only show, and I told some real truths on that in order to give permission to people
Yep.
and face things that may be shaming, or maybe to actually normalize it and show
Mm.
that that's the truth and it's removing the mask. And although the conversations were amazing and then other people admitted things, the next day I call it my shame hangover. Like the next day I was like, oh my god, I felt like I'd gone out and got drunk and done something I shouldn't have done. The next morning I really did experience shame.
Did
I
you?
felt really vulnerable, really afraid of what I'd said. Did I say anything too bad? Did people really accept that about me? And it was a real and I did the show 5 times, and it was almost became research for me. Each time I revealed a little bit more, and it was a
Yep.
small audience, um and each night was really eye-opening and beautiful and really cathartic and extraordinary, especially for, seeing the nodding heads and the like, hooray, and
Mm.
yeah, me too. But the next day, I couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. And yet there was nothing really that I asked myself, what did you say what was really outlandish that you should be really kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And there was nothing terribly outlandish about it.
I
I
think it's
was
just the
just,
act of stepping out and showing ourselves.
mm,
It's
mm,
the act of stepping out and showing ourselves, and and that's what feels challenging. Imagine if you could have done that, and the next morning, instead of feeling shame, you felt empowered, you felt
mm,
confident, you felt like you
yeah.
had achieved something for yourself and helped others.
Mm,
Wouldn't
mm.
that be wonderful?
As the days the shows went on, I reached different levels in myself around it, and it was really incredible research
Yep.
into what that emotion looked like and felt like for me. But I also see these posts on Facebook that it says, can you imagine if we were videoed when we did everything when we were kids? Thank God we weren't around in the day times of the internet.
Yep.
So that really leads me into thinking, I wonder how these kids feel now who are being recorded and it's put on Facebook of really unfortunate things that they're doing when they're either drunk or they get caught busted doing something that is in their mind shameful, and they're embarrassed in front of their peers,
Mm.
and that's then recorded forever. How damaging do you think that is?
I think that's incredibly damaging. And you and I are both old enough to remember, being in our mid-30s, we're old enough to remember.
That's right.
We're old enough to remember a world where if we made a mistake and we did something, it was in the moment. And the worst that there might be is a photo on somebody's Polaroid
Yeah.
or camera that could get developed at the chemist or Big W or something. But aside from that, only the people who were there with us would remember the event and would have access to and it was really a memory, because generally people didn't carry cameras around with them everywhere, right? So it was
Mm,
generally just a memory in a group of friends, and it was the sort of thing that you could kind of do something dumb and then feel perhaps a little bit self-conscious around your friends for the next month or so, and then it goes away.
mm,
But these days, everyone's got their phone with them all the time, right? And everyone's so snap happy, and kids are out there with their phones taking videos, Snapchatting things, taking screenshots of the Snapchats, posting on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, like all this stuff, right? There's so many social media channels now that one mistake, you can be reminded of that mistake for the rest of your life as a
as
child.
well, if it falls into the hands of somebody who has a bit of an issue with you, they forward it on and it can get
Of course.
millions of views. And
Of
I can't
course.
even imagine what that would feel like for a person in their teens who's dealing with all the insecurity of teenager
Oh yeah. I can't imagine what that would
insecurity.
be like. I
Yeah,
wouldn't want that.
awful, awful.
I wouldn't want that.
Mm,
Um, yeah, I wouldn't want that. I can just imagine what that must be like. This shame that a teenager must, we're talking about the shame epidemic. So the shame that a child or a teenager might carry around for
mm,
one mistake, for one unconscious action or one
mm,
unconscious mistake, that it doesn't just stay in the moment and you can leave it in the past because it's been shared amongst everyone,
mm,
and you
mm,
continually get reminded of it. And yeah, these kids, that something happens and it makes it to YouTube and it gets millions of views, and people are commenting and laughing and calling you names, and all these strangers that you don't even know. Whereas when you and I were much younger in our teenage years,
mm,
it was literally a few weeks in our
mm,
little circle of friends and nobody else knew about it outside of that. Now,
mm,
potentially, a teenager can make a mistake or do something silly, and millions of people can have an opinion on their behavior.
mm,
And so
mm,
it's no wonder teen suicide, for instance, is at an all-time high,
mm.
historically speaking, um, because there is such shame for these young people to even then go out and show their face in public.
That's right. I don't know. Like, that's what I think. I just think, wow, the courage they must have to then show up at the school the next day and almost have
Yep.
everybody kind of giggling. And you see the teenager movies where the girl goes to school and she's looking around and everybody's
And
looking at them
everyone's
and laughing.
staring and
They're like,
laughing
what's
and
happened? And
yeah,
I just can't imagine. And that happens so often now. And it makes me think, I wonder why we're doing this to each other. And I wonder when we all actually experience it at some point, I wonder where the unkindness comes from to keep doing this to each other.
yeah. It's all our own perceived limitations that we project outwards to others,
Mm,
onto others. It's our
mm,
perceived limitations, our our perceived failings, our perceived shortcomings. It's all of these things that we then unconsciously project
mm.
outwards.
So we're
It's
almost kind of happy, aren't we, when somebody gets it so wrong so that we can feel superior or
so
something?
we can feel validated in the fact
Mm,
that that person is not as intelligent as me, not as put together as me, that, or maybe it helps us feel validated that even though we feel useless and we feel inadequate and we feel all this stuff, it's actually enjoyable to see somebody else doing something that could be seen as inadequate or silly or stupid or dumb or whatever language we want to use. So it makes us feel better that we're not alone in our
inadequacy.
uselessness. Yeah.
Mm, mm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
so I think a lot of that drives this judgment and our shame epidemic that
Mm,
we
mm.
experience in society.
A
Yep.
lot of the guys that I've been speaking to over the past 12 months, I've chatted to a lot of men around how they feel, obviously, in the modern masculinity. How does it feel to be a modern man,
Yep.
and trying to be in a solid view of what your masculinity is? And a lot of them have said that they feel male shame. Just there was one guy said, I almost just feel like I just need to chop it off, because every time I walk into a room, I'm just embarrassed about being a guy, because whatever I
Wow,
do in
really?
that situation, it's
Mhm.
going to be perceived as sexually sexually kind of approaching somebody
Yeah.
inappropriately, or am I going to be rude if I open a door for I just feel like, how can I show up as a modern masculine
Yep.
when we're so shamed daily for being men? And I just find that so, so devastating. And of course, these guys are raising children as well, raising
Mm.
boys, and they're not sure what to tell their kids to do. And I have to say, at school, I noticed that the girls are allowed to hug, but the boys aren't. And it's kind of keep your
It's
hands to
still out
yourself.
there. It's still out there, isn't it?
And I've got twins, boy girl twins, and I have so much encouragement for them both to behave affectionately in the same way, and to be able to explain their day and their feelings in the same way, so that one, my daughter isn't shamed for being over emotional or dramatic because she's a girl and she might be upset about something, and to be shamed for, being who she is, because she is an out dramatic kind of person.
Yep. Yep.
And that my son can express his emotions and get upset and find things difficult, or feel real compassion for somebody without being shamed about not being tough.
Yeah. And it appearing as though it's weakness in some
Mm,
way. Yeah, there's
mm,
a lot to this, isn't there? We could do so many episodes just picking. We should watch this back and pick out, bits of it and
mm,
speak into, because we can speak so deeply even into that, what we're teaching our boys and girls, our young, let's say primary school age children,
mm,
especially that, and young high school children, on
mm,
what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a boy, what it means to be growing into a man, what it means growing into a woman. There's so much stigma out there about who they're supposed to be and how they're supposed to turn up, and there's shame around boys showing emotion,
mm,
and there's shame around girls appearing over emotional, right?
mm, mm.
And it
And
really
the sexual
creates.
shaming too, sexuality shaming. Like, if a girl
Yep.
sleeps with somebody, slut. If a man sleeps with somebody, he's a legend.
Yep.
That whole kind of thing as well. And there's a lot of shaming around sexuality for girls. That whole thing of, oh, she was dressed for it.
Mm.
The shaming of somebody dressing in a way that can be, misconstrued as sexual,
Yep.
so that they deserve what they get. and
Yep.
and also, funnily enough, my older daughter, who's just incredible, and she spoke to me about how she'd had some sex education at school, and she found that the teacher was really immature about it, and
Really.
almost kind of embarrassed to talk about it. So when you've got an older person in a school talking about um, sexuality and teaching the biology of
Yep.
the body, if they're feeling silly about it, it's already saying that this is kind of shameful and it's embarrassing,
Yep.
just even from the teacher's lead.
Yeah, because we all pick up on cues and energy and energetic stuff as well, don't we? Kids pick up on that stuff. So if you're gonna be if the teacher's gonna be uncomfortable speaking to, and I'll go into something else about that as well. If the teacher's going to be uncomfortable speaking into this stuff, then the children are also, or the young people are going to feel uncomfortable about it, and then bring that into their consciousness and their lives as
Mm,
well. But I
mm.
think there's also another part of this as well. I wonder, is your daughter's teacher male or female?
It was a female.
Right.
Mm,
So
mm,
there's two parts of this as well, right? I know of a male teacher who is a young, um, I think he's like early high school, like year 7, year 8, year 9, somewhere around there. And he had to deliver this sex education talk to his students. And he said, I felt so uncomfortable because he said there were girls in the room, and he's a male teacher in an all-girls private school, right? And he said, I felt so uncomfortable that one of these girls was going to go home to their parents and say, Mr. Whoever taught us about sex today. And one of those parents would 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 feel something about the fact that an adult male, was talking to their daughter about sex.
Mm, mm.
And
Have
he
we
said,
really got that precious?
he said I was almost,
God.
he said I was terrified. And he said, I felt shame. I felt ashamed. And this speaks into our subject. He said, I felt ashamed, even feeling hesitant in having this discussion because I knew it was education and I know what my intentions are, but I didn't know how people were going to view me from an external perspective. A lot
Mm,
of these parents don't know me personally. Maybe they'll think that I did something or said something inappropriate and nobody really knows. So, yeah, we can go into so many
mm,
areas around this, can't we?
mm, mm. Yeah, yeah. And in that sense, how precious are we becoming? What are we shaming people for like
Yeah.
for the tiniest things like that, which should be just accepted as normal? So then really as well, we're just constantly um judging on our ability to accept information.
Yeah. And do you know, I noticed it even in my own social media feeds, in my on my own posts, right? So I support men and I don't not support women. I've just chosen to be focused for men because there's a lack of support out there for men compared to the amount of support there is for women, right? And so I just choose to focus on men. And the amount of times, and I know it's unconscious, and I know they don't mean to do this as a conscious thing, but the amount of times that I post something and I speak into how a man must feel or how this is for men, etc., whatever it is that I talk about, and then almost 100% of the time, I will get a woman commenting, and the same can be said for women. And it's like, I know the same can be said for women, but why do you feel the need to point that out? And
Mm,
I feel, sometimes I feel like, and I don't have to, this is not an imagined thing because I've had women reach out and say, why don't you, what do you hate women or something, do you? Why do you have all this men's rights stuff happening and you don't speak about women? It's like, it's not that I don't support women. I support men. If you wish to support women, you can. And they have this unconscious thing going that maybe it's a story, maybe it's an unconscious pattern that we see out there. People who support men are against women,
mm,
right?
mm,
And I think there's a stigma out there around that. And people react to it and respond negatively to sometimes to the stuff that I do. And I know it's unconscious, but it still happens. Rather than saying, that's a really good perspective, it's like, well, the same thing is for women. Why don't you talk about that for women too?
mm, mm.
And
Yeah,
then
and in
in
order
my
to
early
heal it,
days,
we have to talk about both sides very clearly.
yeah,
And so then we can start bringing up the shame between the genders. We can start talking about all of the difficulties, all of the stuff that's shameful that's happened in the past. And I think we mentioned this before around a book that said it was really quite hard to read because it was so much around what had been done to women through history
yeah,
that it was so hard to read. And I felt bad for the guys who would read it because I know where they're at in their minds in society today. But it's still a book that needed to be written so it can be recognized, so it can start the healing, because it's like anything. There's a shame there for men of what's been done in the past. And
yeah.
I think what we're doing in return is we are in turn doing behaviors that in the future we will then look back and say, that wasn't right either. So we're just reacting badly against stuff that we should be accepting from the past, and that then flows into the future, because only by acknowledging all of it, like we said earlier, can we really start the open acceptance, the less judgment,
Mm.
and just the kind of group global understanding that there's more than one way to skin a cat, right?
Absolutely. And you know what, Helen, as with everything, it always starts with us internally. And for the men out there, it's like, for how long, for how long must the sons pay for the perceived sins of the fathers? and the grandfathers and the great grandfathers. And for how much longer do do the daughters have to feel like the victims that the mothers, grandmothers, and great grandmothers perhaps were, right?
Mm,
And I think at some point we have to draw a line in the sand and go, you know what? That was the past. This is the future. If we continue to bring the stuff from the past that didn't work in society into the future, we're going to continue to create the same experience.
mm.
And so, a lot of, if we want to go into that subject, which that's a big subject,
We've
you know,
spoke probably about, I'd say, 10 subjects we could do just on the shame in that particular subject.
yeah, we
Um,
really have,
like,
because
and
it's
that's because there's a shame epidemic.
there is, and I think we probably should wrap it up because we could just go on forever.
Yeah.
I know I could. Every subject that we talk about, I could just talk about it forever. So,
But it's amazing just how far it's gone, how many little kind of pockets we found within this one topic
absolutely.
because it's
And
everywhere.
we continue to perpetuate the shame epidemic as
Mm,
individuals, not as a society, but as individuals, because it's the individuals that create the collective consciousness, right? And the collective stigmas and the collective discriminations or whatever it is that we carry as a society. It starts always with the individual. And
mm,
so when we start to take self responsibility for the fact that we can behave badly because we're human and we're subject to all of that, and we can think things that we would rather not think, the best the best way to, as an individual, to start to overcome this societal uh, shame epidemic that we experience is to take personal responsibility. Don't try to avoid it, or deny it or suppress it. It's like, I did the wrong thing, I know I did the wrong thing, right?
mm,
And so if you need to apologize to someone, do the right thing, step in, take responsibility, make sure you don't do it again. And for everybody else out there, it's about having a more non-judgmental attitude towards others, understanding that we're all capable of doing these things and thinking these things and behaving in certain ways. And so if
mm.
I were to summarize our whole discussion today, which I think the length of it, we might have to break this up into part one and part two. We'll see. Um, I think the message, and I'd love for you to speak into this as well, but I would love for people to take that away. It's really like many other things. It's about personal responsibility. We don't have to have a shame epidemic if we're all taking personal responsibility for our own stuff and not feeling the need to judge others as well.
Mm, mm. For me, in that, I have a slightly different take on the fact that what I believe is needed is forgiveness, self compassion, and forgiveness. Because, yes, we can feel shame because we know what we did was wrong. But then to really sit with, who are we as a person? We know that we all have the capacity to do it. And so, therefore, it means that a lot of people probably have. What are our circumstances around why we did that? What do we feel about ourselves? Can we cut ourselves a break for that? Can we have compassion and then really have that extra level, which is the forgiveness of it, to say, look, I'm okay with the fact that I did that, and I'm not going to feel the guilt for it. I'm not going to take it
Yep.
into the next situation where I have to face this. I'm not going to feel embarrassed when I see that person. I'll apologize to them. And if they don't accept my apology, I'm still going to feel okay with how I behaved because
Yep.
I've forgiven myself for that because I know where I was when I did that.
Yep.
And of course that doesn't work on all of the behaviors. Some of them it's kind of like, no, actually you might be being a bit of a prick. But on a
And
lot of
sometimes we
them,
have to atone. Sometimes
that's
we do
right.
have to atone, right?
So, but a
Yep.
lot of the things that we carry that we believe to be shameful or we believe to be embarrassing or guilty about, it's the minor stuff. And once we forgive ourselves and we throw the compassion directly back at our own soul, we then have the capacity to forgive
Yep.
other shaming situations where we can say, "Oh my God, I totally get why you would have done that. Look, I've done that in the past. And, I've had to forgive myself for that. And here I am passing that on to you because we can only offer what we actually embody. So by embodying our own forgiveness and compassion
Yep.
overall, over all of the incredible amount of dumb things we do during our lifetime, we can then offer that compassion out, especially to people coming through who haven't learnt that yet, instead of really shaming younger people who are still learning, and really offering that compassion and love forward, and then being able to speak up about people who should know better and
Mm,
say, yeah, I get that. I can forgive that you did that, but you should know better than that.
yeah.
And being able to hold that conversation.
Mm. Awesome.
Mm,
Well, so the antidote to our shame epidemic in society is compassion, forgiveness, taking personal responsibility, and having a very non-judgmental attitude
mm.
towards ourselves and others.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Helen. Another beautiful, insightful, wonderful conversation. I've
Thank
enjoyed this.
you. Lots to it. Lots, lots, lots.
And just a quick reminder to everybody watching, please send us your questions. If you're connected with us on Facebook, send us whatever question you got from any episode that you've watched, or if you've watched all of them. Thank you for being so loyal. And we'd love for you to ask us whatever question you have in your mind about anything that we've recorded, anything we've spoken about. Message us, email us. So I think this has got some legs now, Helen. So I think we might create a Facebook page and email address and all that sort of stuff, so that people can email their questions in as well. So we might, in the next episode, we'll announce an email address that people can contact us through. There is a King Arthur and the Lady of the Lake Facebook page, which by the time you see this episode out there, it will be established and we'll have some content on there and everything will be done. So you can also feel free to message that Facebook page with your question as well. So you can email, which will let you know in the next episode, or you can message us via the Facebook page, or you can ask us the question on our YouTube channel on any one of our videos, or message us through YouTube, whatever you feel is appropriate for you. So very
Lots of
good.
ways to contact us.
It's not hard to get in contact with us these days in social media. You know my name, you know Helen's name. So look us up and send us a message, ask us a question, and we're compiling them all now so that we can do a big Q&A for the final episode.
Probably, are we doing it this before Christmas or in January?
Yeah, we'll do the Q&A hopefully before Christmas. We'll try and get it in before Christmas.
Fabulous.
Let's try and do that.
Awesome.
All right. Thank
All
you
right,
everybody
lovely
for watching.
people. See you later.